Hi, good morning. First of all, thanks to all of you for coming out early on this Friday morning. I would like to, I'll keep my opening quite brief, because we're running a little behind schedule. Those who have been fortunate or unfortunate enough to sit through a class with me know that I have a mania for punctuality, so it's a little bit painful for me to be starting my comments at 8:32 when I have until 8:30 to complete them. That being said, we can't go on before thanking a few people who have been instrumental in making what I think promises to be an extremely exciting day. First of all, our sponsors, which a few moments ago you could read their names up there, Citi, BCG, IBM, there it is. Citi, BCG, IBM, and Goldman Sachs. Our media sponsors, the Wall Street Journal, Inc., Fast Company, BNet, and Next Billion. And of course, the many people who, whose help was critical in making today what it promises to be. The student organizers of the event, Dan Janawi and Lucia Villar, the Social Enterprise Program Office, in particular Sandra Navalli and their tireless efforts, the governing board of the conference who have lent us their expertise and connections to make the day what it is, and Scott Peters, who sits on the advisory board of the Social Enterprise Program at Columbia Business School, who's really helped to move this conference forward and make it into the great event that it is today. Now, the Social Enterprise Program at Columbia Business School has as its overarching mission to advance our understanding of this vast domain where management practice meets social interest and to create the next generation of leaders in the field of social enterprise. Now, given our place at a university, at an institution of higher learning, it's natural that our focus is on promoting the exchange and creation of new ideas and innovations, and this conference is really the centerpiece of those efforts to promote the exchange and creation of new ideas and innovations. I'm asked all the time why we've seen such enormous growth in this field the last few years. And my answer at this point is, I don't really know. You can ask me, why did the Industrial Revolution take place in the middle of the 19th century? It's a complicated story, lots of reasons, but it's happening. So regardless of the reasons, it's a very exciting time to be in this field. There's an explosion of interest in harnessing these entrepreneurial energies to affect social change. And there are a great many people, many of whom are in this room, that are developing new business models to serve these social goals. Now, some of these have achieved considerable scale. And I think the poster child for this is the microfinance movement that now can boast a global footprint, has brought financial access to millions and millions and millions worldwide. And of course, the founder of the modern microfinance movement, Muhammad Yunus, has a Nobel Prize to show for it. But what we're here to talk about today, in large part, is where will the next wave of social innovation, or where will the next waves of social innovations come from, and what can we do to make sure that we are effective in selecting, nurturing, and growing these promising new ideas. There are many outstanding questions. What will be the role of investors? How can entrepreneurs best harness the resources available to them? What's the place of government in promoting this process? And even just basic questions about in which instance, what is the most effective way of organizing innovation? Nonprofit, for-profit, somewhere in between, something entirely different. And the purpose of today is to try to give a little more clarity to these questions, to come up with some tentative answers or start answering these questions. Now, we of course need inspired individuals to move this process along. And I would add parenthetically that we should do whatever we can to promote and inspire these individuals. that is, provide them the financial resources to attend Columbia Business School and otherwise learn about how to become a part of this movement. But they also need ideas to guide them. And again, that is the purpose of today's discussions. Our less than humble goal is to have everyone in this room, and I actually think this is quite a grandiose objective, everyone walk out seeing the world a little bit differently. Hopefully with a little more clarity rather than a little less clarity, but sometimes the path to enlightenment is a complicated one. With a few new ideas on how you will go out and make the world a better place. Now, we're very fortunate to have with us, to open this conversation, Bob Annibale, one such source of fresh ideas and thinking on the topic. Bob is the General Director of Citi Microfinance, and I'll note that he started into the microfinance movement long before it was cool. So he's been at this for many, many years. He leads Citi's commercial relationships with microfinance institutions, providing financing and product partnerships to institutions that serve the poor and unbanked. Now, he has been a real agent of transformation within Citi and in this movement more broadly. He is much sought after as a speaker and a thought leader, and is asked to sit on far more boards and advisory councils than is surely for his own good. This includes, among others, the Center for the Study of African Economies at Oxford University, the Executive Committee at CGAP, and many, many others. And without taking away any more time from Bob's comments, I'll turn it over to him now. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you to the organizers for this opportunity to join you for the Social Enterprise Conference today, and I will try to stay brief enough that there's time for conversation, as Ray mentioned, afterwards. And I start too with the Industrial Revolution. Why did it begin when it began? I don't know either, but nor do I know exactly why I began doing this when I did. In terms of, after many years of working internationally at Citigroup in Athens and Nairobi and Bahrain and London, elsewhere, mostly because I guess I'd always worked in emerging markets and in environments where the work of microfinance, or the need for the work that microfinance was illustrating, was so needed and so obvious that the intersection between what I was doing or our organization was present and doing, and what these organizations were doing in the same market became clear to me was about more than philanthropy and corporate social responsibility. It was a natural continuum of providing access to financial services to the majority. And as I think of the majority, when I first started looking at this area, one of the people I was at a conference with long ago was Professor Prahalad, and his whole Bottom of the Pyramids was quite fashionable at that moment, the book that came out, Prophets of the Bottom of the Pyramids. And I was working for someone, Stan Fisher, who you probably have all used at some point, Fisher and Dornbusch's economics book. He was, again, the chief economist of the IMF and World Bank. He was at MIT, and he was vice chairman at Citi. And that conference tone kept becoming about BOP, and it was like, profits at the bottom of the pyramid. Bottom of the pyramid became very buzzy in Chicago and elsewhere, the business schools. And one day talking with Stan Fisher and saying, we're looking at these opportunities, people keep bringing us about BOP. And he kept looking at me dazed and finally said, what does it have to do with balance of payments? And I realized we'd been creating this other whole tangent in terms of the way we were speaking about what I really think are the bulk of the population, or about providing access to services and products to the majority in any of the countries we work in, as opposed to a specific narrow segment that implies very often. I think today we're also very, very fortunate to have two very impressive speakers and friends of mine, Peter Boom from the Triodos Bank of the Netherlands, which is really a leading institution, I think, in Europe, not just in its early work and investment in microfinance, but its work on environmental, sustainable finance and many other areas. And Raj Shah, who I've known for a long time, and he was previously at Gates after early work in the Clinton administration, and now with USAID, both both of them very active in this whole issue of what we'll explore, meaning by social enterprise. I always have to question myself what that exactly means. But, and I'll leave it to you to determine whether you think Citi is really an agent and a factor or a player in social enterprise. But I do want to say that I believe that when we launched the idea of microfinance and how we would approach it at Citi after many, many years of working on it from philanthropy, it was clearly a decision that was not based on CSR or a particular obligation that had to be provided. But it was actually the thinking that there was an opportunity to engage our businesses in doing something very new and scalable and sustainable commercially. And I think that's what it's proven. I think as you think of the language of Vikram Pandit, who is a very passionate alum of Columbia, our CEO, he sees it very much as an example within a wider spectrum of responsible finance, which really has to do with the whole behavior and the way you operate, and one that's is being well tested and observed for the financial sector overall now. But it is about how we do it from our business as opposed to how we do it from other agents that we may have of change, such as the work of our foundations and others. And I think I want to give that sense to you in a minute. And so whilst it's been a focus of support for some 30 years of the Citi Foundation, the first grants went back to 1982 with Axion International, organizations that were nonprofits that were innovating and experimenting and investing in organizations that were agents clearly of change, though not many were of scale at that time. It was an awareness after many years of doing that the need in this sector and the opportunity was for more than philanthropy. It really was about engaging our own businesses. And it was about looking at organizations and institutions that were doing totally new for bankers, new things, using unique credit models, low cost origination and distribution, some of whom were doing livelihoods development, others were doing really what we might just call financial access. But they were doing it in a way that was outside the mainstream of financial circles, but had the need also to interject at some point with those. And how would we, being in the same countries very often in the same footprint, find that footprint to go beyond looking at those organizations as beneficiaries and thinking of them as clients and partners in terms of change and business? So we launched that about a little over 5 years ago, I guess. And today, Citi Microfinance, through our businesses around the world, work with over 100 institutions in some 40 countries as clients and partners. And they are, in that sense, quite a wide parish, as one of my colleagues likes to describe them. They include small NGOs, right up to very large ones, like BROC in Bangladesh, that serve millions, but is still a nonprofit. They include a large number of institutions, which discussions in microfinance today are quite vibrant around, that were originally nonprofits, but say in the example of India, have become non-bank finance companies in order to be able to operate on a regulatory framework that it gives them more powers, but also to raise capital in order to expand. So those non-bank finance companies. And then they include, and some of those have become quite commercialized, in not only their operation, but their ownership. And that also includes then specialized banks, microfinance banks, which have gotten full licenses to be deposit-taking entities, and some of those large ones we know in Bangladesh, but also now in Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, and elsewhere. A whole range of institutions that before we would have described probably as non-target market. We would have said these are institutions that whenever I spoke about them, someone said, you know, why don't you talk to the foundation about them? And not our financial institutions group, looking at these names. And so we started to try to understand the sector and define it. And one thing we looked at quite early as we looked at our involvement in an area of this area of financial inclusion was that we were probably not best equipped to do this ourselves. Clearly, our own footprint, as big as it is in many countries, and I always give the example to people, you know, we have over twice the number of branches in Mexico than we do in the United States. And we opened in the Congo long before we opened in Connecticut. And I bet on the Congo in the long run myself as a franchise. But our history goes back very differently. That's really the footprint of Citi. So when we looked, we realized as big as we may be in Mexico or India or elsewhere where we would have a large consumer bank too, we didn't really know about this client segment. We didn't have branches anywhere in the right areas to serve them. our employees and our staff were largely very urban and urban-based, be they local nationals almost, entirely around the world now. When you really looked at it and said, would you really be delivering microfinance yourself? And the answer was no. It was, though, we could work with institutions that could and could do much more. And by working with them and integrating some of our activities and some product development together, we could access and originate product, but also access to capital and funding in local markets for a range of institutions that had not really had that contact before. And also, I think the other thought was, we're in the same places. When I'm with Professor Yunus, and he started in Chittagong in Bangladesh, but we have a Citibank in Chittagong. So it's very familiar, these markets. So when we work in Bangladesh with organizations in microfinance, we do it in Bengali and Dhaka under Bangladeshi law. I mean, it's very familiar to everybody who works at Citibank of Bangladesh. It may not be in New York or London or Geneva, or where you might do microfinance from offshore and do funding, but it certainly was to us. And so the other reality was, how do we use this footprint in Kampala or Asuncion or Mexico City or Hanoi, wherever there is that city piece, to engage with this sector from a commercial perspective and have the impact of bringing scale, hopefully, and some product, but also efficiency and technology to the sector that had long been dominated by a donor approach, including by banks. So we set about setting up internally, I think, the change that's required for large companies that want to go into what you might call social enterprise or into any of these areas. And that was about changing and embedding in our DNA definitions of what this all meant. What is a microfinance institution and what isn't it? What are the target markets of this sector for us at Citi? What about credit policies? If you open our investment bank credit policy, which I'm sure not many people would want to do, or the consumer bank or elsewhere, you'll find sections under microfinance in Citi. You'll find debt rating models for capital allocation charges and deriving risk models for microfinance institutions, including buckets, because these are very diverse types of institutions. We have senior specialist risk officers and initials that can approve for this sector, and we've got global and local documentation specific for working with microfinance institutions in the sector. So it was about embedding an activity into our core business, building industry expertise, defining what you could do and what you didn't think you could do. And again, once speaking in California with Professor Yunus, it was very clear he was speaking on a panel as banker to the poor, because he has a book, Banker to the Poor. And then I was speaking after him, and it was banker to the poor. And that was very much what we do. We work with those institutions and with organizations like that. But we knew the boundaries of what we could and couldn't do. I think the idea of bringing some of the tools that were not available before to organizations that you would see as making a significant social impact. And I'll use an example of BROC in Bangladesh. I don't know how many of you know them. It's one of the largest NGOs in the world. It's almost a state within the state, because BROC not only used to be the Bangladesh Rural Agricultural Cooperative, and today it does everything. They have some 30 or 40,000 teachers that work for BROC. They have healthcare. They have dairy and pasteurization programs. They've got cooperatives. And they also have a bank, a full bank license, and they use their NGO for microfinance. So BROC is someone we worked with in Bangladesh, and they, while staying very focused on what they wanted to achieve, their mission and even their legal vehicle in being a nonprofit, were growing at a pace that to access capital was a limitation and savings, but they had the potential of doing more. So there we did a securitization of $150 loans from a nonprofit into an SPV, a special purpose vehicle, the kind of thing you all probably study here, and issued notes, AAA rated notes off of them in the local domestic market in Dhaka, and raised over a period of 6 years over $250 million of additional funding for them. And it was about using a tool we normally would have done with another financial institution, a commercial bank or someone else, and applying it to this sector to try to help achieve scale and access to domestic markets, but ordinarily you wouldn't find because it's a nonprofit. Similarly, whether doing bank syndications for microfinance institutions in Pakistan or Romania, bond issues in Peru or Mexico, or financing in many, many other countries, right up to the more controversial ones that you often, spirit of the controversy now anyway, the IPOs in microfinance, where you have institutions that began as nonprofits, became non-bank finance companies, bringing in additional capital. The shareholder of the majority of the, originally being the nonprofit, remains very much the majority shareholder very often, but getting to the point of growth where to really expand, and perhaps the ambition of some management, they want to raise a great deal more capital, and you have organizations which we've had now in Mexico and in India more recently with SKS that actually go to the domestic markets and do an IPO and issue equity, and we saw phenomenal, pricing and oversubscriptions. The one in India for SKS was over 13 times oversubscribed. And so we saw this very rapid transformation happening in a sector, many of them which were small NGOs not long ago. I always say NGO, nonprofits, but and had now found themselves doing an IPO and being a listed company in their national markets, and the same in Compatamos, which is now the largest microfinance institution in Latin America. So quite a range of institutions and activities. However, then there were the majority of them, which are much smaller, and bringing down costs of operations became an issue. So how do you use the technology we would use or our other clients would use? Bringing in operations and technology, kind of the boring parts, but the payment systems, linking that with the mobile payments and other transaction services, which I think can help bring down cost enormously for small transactions and clients that would not fit in the products that have been built really for the minority in most countries. And since we know even in countries like Mexico, an OECD middle income neighboring country, still the majority of the population doesn't have access to a bank account, let alone formal credit. And so we have the challenge, and we realize that products were designed not for the majority in any of these markets, and nor were the institutions, nor their footprints, nor their cost base. And I often make that analogy very much to the cell phone industry. I mean, bankers are not the most dynamic in most ways, and it's perhaps the most heavily regulated industry in many cases, maybe they in pharmaceuticals or something, but very heavily. But nobody's waiting anymore for the wire to come down the road to get linked to the phone exchange. I mean, I was young enough to remember in Brazil people buying from each other your landline, your regular telephone number, because it took so long to get a phone. Now, and geographies didn't have them at all. Just about everywhere, in unprecedented numbers, people are buying a cell phone. Low-income, poor people are buying a cell phone that's unsubsidized, completely commercial, high tax-paying companies, because you can capture it all, and they're connecting to the most current technology with very little difference between what they'll have or you'll have, other than the handset you may choose to use. But I have an old handset, so mine is very little different than anybody else who might, in a village or elsewhere, turn on a cell phone. But financial services weren't going and aren't going at that pace. So that whole kind of transformation in giving access and social, both social, I would say, in the sense of especially the cell phone, and as well as commercial and financial benefit, is the sort of paradigm that we challenge ourselves to. And it is about, when we moved into working with organizations in microfinance, it was definitely not about opening more branches as a way of achieving financial inclusion. That sort of innovation is old and over. That's waiting for the line to come down the road. Not that there isn't a role for branches and a need in locations where people have a contact, but it became this rapid change, and we saw it in places like Mexico where the enabling legislation was there, for agencies and third parties, where basically your bank branches became mini branches in gas stations and pharmacies and phone exchanges, where people didn't have to go even into the next town to receive a remittance or make a deposit or cash a check or pay a utility bill. And in countries like Brazil, by working with the National Lottery Office, if you go to Brazil, you go to the National Lottery Office, which is a very popular place everywhere you go, you can do loads of your transactions for the Caixa Econômica, for the savings bank. And in Brazil today, because even the Bradesco, the bank, is in many of the post offices around the country, every municipality in the country has access to a financial institution. But they didn't go and build branches everywhere all over again. And so when we look for this rapid transformation, this whole push of enterprise, it is about collaboration as well. It is finding institutions that have this product, this outreach, and this knowledge, and most of which we've found had begun as nonprofits, and in many cases stay, but the majority have had in one form or another transform, and then making the link. Where is the linkage that then allows them to become part of the national payment system or the savings system, or partner with large financial institutions that are not going to ever be in those geographies? and don't need to be maybe, because the post office is there, or the National Lottery office is there, and the cell phone provider is there. Most of you will also know about the product new involvements in places like Kenya, where the M-Pesa system is a way of transferring money using what was Vodafone Safaricom. In Kenya, it has grown in 4 years or so, probably outstripped the banking system in the last 100 years in the terms not just of subscribers, as all phone companies have done in places like Africa, but in the ability to make transfers and payments of very small amounts for very little more cost than an SMS message. And to be able to send money up country to rural areas from cities for very small sums using your cell phone technology. And more importantly, using agents. The agents that everyone goes to charge up your phone, because very few people have a contract in most of the world, other side of sort of Europe and American places. Most people have prepaid phones. You go and charge them up. And so the same kiosk that would charge up your phone, well, why couldn't they also give you money back? Because as you know, I don't know if it's so common in the States, I live in London, but certainly everywhere there, when you're in a supermarket, they ask, would you like cash back? The first thing they ask you in the UK is, do you want cash back? Because cash costs money. Everybody wants to get rid of it. It's idle, and you have to pay the bank to take cash if you're a retailer, because they don't want it either, and physically move it. So the idea that the same kiosk that you buy your minutes of airtime could be where you go to receive money, take a credit back from that's been transferred to you by somebody in the city or your family, or use them as a place to make a deposit via your phone and receive the cash, totally expands the access points around the country and drops the cost dramatically beyond anything just straight banking could provide. And so as we looked at this intersection between what were social enterprises, indisputably as microfinance institutions, and then mainstream telecoms operators and banks, it became very interesting for us and to try to find where that intersection works. I found, at least at Citi, it came very clear to us that we would do everything pretty much through a partnership model. We were not going to become a phone company, and we weren't going to become a microfinance institution, but we could work with both. And we could expand dramatically access to people of services and products at scale and cost that we could never do working alone. Most interestingly, more recently, since February, I've been asked to look at the United States as well and head up what we call community development. And when I find it fascinating, and as the census shows, 1 in 7 Americans live below the poverty level, this is, for me, a very familiar space. I mean, that 1 in 7 is particularly familiar to me. And it is intriguing, again, how do you reach beyond where we are through our own bricks and mortar in our domestic market? We do a project out in Queens, New York, with Grameen America. And I'm not quite sure, nobody was sure what that would mean when Grameen wanted to do their group lending model in an urban metropolitan area like in New York, but they are. And they've been moving, it's been moving very quickly and smoothly thus far, with very good performance. And they're only lending to women in small groups, many of them immigrants and other low-income women in the Queens, Brooklyn area, and northern Manhattan now. And we began working with them on another product, which how do you get savings accounts to these type of clients? Because what they found was the vast majority of the women don't have a savings account even, or a transaction account. But yet, this was not rural. This was not, challenges of post-conflict societies or rural agricultural societies or some of the places that we would look at in many other countries. These people live, not even miles from branches of ours and hundreds of other bank branches in their community. And it is the idea to me that where I think social enterprise and social finance, certainly if there's such a thing term, interjects is that to reach large numbers of people who you don't have the contact point even if you have the physical presence, is because you didn't design that presence, the marketing, the product, really to reach this community. It doesn't reach for whatever reason. You need an aggregator, and you need an organization that understands the needs of communities, particularly when I look at low-income communities, that understand the appropriateness of product for that community and the accompanying, sometimes, resources that need to go with it, whether it's financial education or otherwise. And that's become how we've done what we're doing. It is to partner with an organization. So yes, we have almost 3,000 of those women now have a savings account with Citi in a very short period of time who never would have had one. But that's because we had a partner that could help us originate those accounts. And to make it economically sustainable, commercially based, too, those accounts are largely opened up in their home, which it isn't for most people. And they come into a bank and branch, Citibank branch, you'll see there's Grameen American clients welcome here because there's so many of them in 1 or 2 branches. They show their ID and they get their account activated in their first debit card. And you sort of took out the whole cost and awkwardness, frankly, of an account opening process and brought it to somebody in their home with an organization that's doing for them much more than only opening a bank account. And that concept of aggregation, you know, in reaching what Prahalad might have called the bottom of the pyramid, to me is really a question of finding the appropriateness of both product and outreach and to do origination like that. And in the United States, one other area, if you think of it, now that when you hit 50, you start getting mail from this group, AARP, AARP, the American Association of Retired People. It's so sad. But anyway, they found me. Even though I live in London, I said, I have an address here, and they find me. So, you know, nobody wanted to do business with old people, one at a time, right? Who wanted old people when they started 30 years ago? Giving them a supplementary health insurance or selling them or any other product or service. But when you have 30 or 40 million members, everybody wants to work with you. 40 million members of anything. And it was the aggregation and the ability to reach beyond the straight marketing and product distribution that others were doing that created an intermediary in many ways of services for people who in many cases were very underserved. And I think the concept in this market, in environments like the United States, where you talk of microfinance or access to financial inclusion, we need that too. I don't think that, you know, we're not seeing it happen fast enough anyway, that organically financial institutions will just reach everybody that they've missed so far. And they've reached the majority, you know, for better or worse, as we know, but not everybody. And are you reaching them with the right product? Is it appropriate? And is it designed with truly knowing the client that others may know? And so this is how we've approached it. We've recently did a fund here called Communities at Work Fund. So we put $199 million of the $200 million in a fund that's managed by 2 fund managers that have done both of nonprofit organizations, but they have been working for years, Calvert Foundation and Opportunity Finance Network, of lending to community development finance institutions. Almost all the borrowers in that are nonprofits, but there are specialized loan funds that reach beyond where banks go into very small businesses, community services, affordable housing, and elsewhere. And so it's about downstreaming and making these linkages. And I think that's very much how we've based. And I just came on Tuesday from San Francisco, where with the mayor of San Francisco, we launched a product which is called K2C. I have to remember, kindergarten to college. It's because somebody at lunch was saying it's kindergarten at cocktails because it was such a long day. And we started in the kindergarten and we ended the evening with cocktails, so you have to get K to C as college. And it is about every kid as they enter the school system of San Francisco getting a savings account when they come in and getting $50 or $100 starter at 5 or 6 years old when the account is open, and having incentive programs with nonprofits and community organizations and others all the way through, along with the financial education built into the school program, to have a history and learning about savings. You know, competitions, the class that does best, the people who have the highest attendance. You know, just as you would with sports and other events, they're going to do it around savings and try to build the assets of kids, many of whom's parents don't have an account. Now, if you know San Francisco proper, it's very small. Oakland, San Jose, and others are very challenging communities, but they're not even part of the city. I believe the city of San Francisco issues more dog licenses than children enter the school system every year, in the public school system. So it has a very defined community that goes to the state school system, and great gap between that and many others in the city. But we also look at statistics and say children who have a savings account have almost 7 times the likelihood of going to college than ones who don't. And it's not because they have a lot of money in the savings account only, but because they've learned how to manage along the way. And they've built a culture of also juggling and financing and staying through college. And that's we have a big project with United Negro College Fund and the KIPP charter schools also in the United States of opening savings accounts for kids that they go into each of those schools. And the numbers are staggering of kids who can come out with a college scholarship but not have enough money to make it beyond that, because many of these kids are also looking after family and have other obligations. So it's about a continuum of savings. I don't think we could go at that pace without partnering, whether it's in this case with the city and a number of community organizations, or it's the charter schools, or it's the Grameen Americas. But we can reach large numbers much quicker by combining and leveraging ourselves together. I don't know where this fits in the discussion of social enterprise. I think others will better define it and analyze it. I mean, it is interesting. In London, I was approached for someone doing a book on it and interviews as being a social entrepreneur. I didn't know what a social entrepreneur was. I thought my secretary got it wrong. I thought it was a social entrepreneur, and I don't go to a lot of those conferences in social entrepreneurship. We have the Skoll ones at Oxford that are quite a big jamboree and things. And I'm kind of focused on what we were doing in a number of the partners. I tend to see people going there and coming back in London. But it was about agents of change from within large corporations is really what they were looking at, where there is a social impact, a positive, I assume, social impact. And I guess it did have me thinking in some ways about the process of change for social enterprise within large existing companies, because often we think of it within as startups in many ways, right? Because the great entrepreneurship and enterprise, small enterprises, and I see them all the time for finance and looking at ways of promoting them. But it was about how do you implement change in a very large organization. And I think there's complementary to that is the way the city of San Francisco has tried to do it as a municipality or government, and embed it into your business model. And I just would share that it isn't, I never thought of ourselves as part of a CSR. We don't actually have a corporate social responsible department as such. I'm not quite sure who that would be. I mean, maybe some people would think it's us, or what I'm doing and community development is doing. But CSR was, in many ways, risked always being siloed itself. And we have a fabulous foundation, and it's been an innovator and led for years. And there were people doing things that you would address perhaps in CSR. But in the end, we still have to look at the rest of the balance sheet. The other, $2 trillion in 100 countries and 230,000 people or whatever. What are they doing? And so it was about, for us, the challenge of trying to embed much of the learning that had gone on in those other organizations and with partners into our own business. And I think that is in many ways the challenge of where you look at social enterprise when you look at very large companies. Clearly there are people who are trying to reach bottom of the pyramid. Now selling at the bottom of the pyramid or selling to the majority of people who don't have access today doesn't necessarily have a social implication. I mean, it may be inclusive. I mean, everybody gets Coca-Cola. There's nothing wrong with it. Or everybody has access to a cell phone. That has probably more positive economic, it's a tool. But I still, I'm very careful. We're very careful about ourselves attributing what we do to leading to this. And I did a piece, traveled with somebody from the New Yorker some years ago to Mexico and took her to see a lot of the microfinance organizations we worked with. And she kept getting, at the end of the article even said, Bob won't, though, say that his work is development or poverty alleviation or whatever. And we could never attest to that or make that claim. One is we don't measure it that way. We don't have the mandate to do that, nor do we have the expertise. I would just feel totally uncomfortable about that. But we work with some amazing people who probably do. And I tended to feel comfortable, and that's where we go. We bring access to products and services that I hope empower, I hope give opportunity, that are inclusive. But it's not, we have to be very careful about what you claim to be. And microfinance itself, all its good and the great hype and visibility it now has also suffered from the fact that did you really understand the impact and did you study it? And I'm, quite agnostic to the sense that there's a role for financial inclusion, has enormous merit in its own right, just as literacy does, just as many other things, universal access to water and other things. I think it's almost a requirement that you have, in any society to be able to give people mobility and choice. But that's a different claim than saying I'm doing poverty alleviation or livelihoods development. And I think we work with organizations that do a whole range of those things. And we need to accept that if you're talking about the majority of a population in most countries, you really do have to segment that majority as well and say, what are they seeking and what are you delivering? And when I look in the microfinance sector, I look at a range of institutions, and including those for which did IPOs and that are people very excited about, right down to small nonprofits, and then the specialized banks and the postal banking accounts and all sorts of other players that when you look at 80% of a country that doesn't have access to financial services, no one of them is going to provide it and provide it appropriately for everyone. So I think one of the things, and we look at social enterprise, and we've learned it from microfinance too, is have you done really impact studies? And just be careful of what you claim. because you don't always need to make the claim beyond what you're actually doing and the merit of it. I see a lot of people doing, you will have it here, you know, renewable energy and solar panels or lights or lanterns and stoves, you know, again, improving for healthcare, you know, stoves in many countries, like I said, in India, I'm seeing a group of them, water filters and selling these units and things. All of them have enormous merit. And I think that one just needs to be able to say, be careful you don't try to put it too deeply in one special bucket of the holy and leave all the others out. And those who are out, you know, should just be modest in what they describe themselves as doing and let others attribute it as you feel appropriately. And that, I think, has been one of the things about, you know, I find when I'm covered, our work is covered in somewhere recently, it was in another book called Hip Investor. I thought, hip investor, that's really, you know, such a groovy investor or whatever. I mean, what is that? You know, I mean, and I understood what he meant when, you know, you got away from just the acronym. But I just say as a sector, and as you study this sector and you define it, you need to figure what attributes make it a social enterprise versus one that's not. For example, my colleagues often show me names. We have credit policies that make it, you know, differentiate how we work with microfinance, and they'll think that's a window for doing other institutions that they couldn't cover under, as financial institutions, you know, group would do normally as a target market. And there'll be consumer finance companies. And South Africa has many, particularly that, they don't have many microfinance. These are truly companies that are just lending against salaried employees, sometimes just civil servants, and installment loans with all the normal attributes, whether it's a high interest rate, however you want to perceive it. But in the end of the day, where do you draw your boundary between what is a microfinance institution providing access to finance, you know, which cannot measure that everybody who borrows has used it only to generate incremental income, and a consumer finance company, which reaches many, many more people globally than microfinance probably does. And it is in that subtlety of boundaries and definition that all of us have to find that. And when you define similarly what is a social enterprise and what is a commercial enterprise, and can they not be the same, or in part? So whether we are or not was something I leave to many of you to decide. And I think what I always say is it's a matter that as this group, at least, and in our community development, we work with some pretty amazing institutions who definitely are. But they also lacked scale at sometimes and access to tools and capital, and they very much were incubators of innovation. But without that combination of types of institutions and markets, very hard to see such scale. Overall, I guess, you know, you could say, well, I've had some notes of what was asked of me a bit. What's really been the impact on somewhere like Citi of doing this? Well, we've replicated increasingly in the US and elsewhere these sort of pattern. Certainly, it had a disproportionate public resonance that I didn't expect. For the size of what you do, no matter how much we do. If we raise $1 billion in microfinance around the world to institutions who are lending on average, you know, not very $150, $200, $300, $400, that had a huge impact and attention and reputational benefit, I think, that we didn't expect. And yet we also, remember, we like the economy in general, went through a pretty rough patch, maybe we more than the economy even in general. But as we reduced, you know, $500 billion of assets or so, we didn't slow our growth in this sector because we'd found a way also to achieve returns on capital and risk that were commensurate with what we needed in our businesses. In Citi, none of the microfinance, I should say, where we work with these institutions around the world. The relationship management is local in all the countries where the name of the institution is. It usually sits in a financial institutions group as the relationship manager. All the assets and the risks sit in the business. There is no box at our head office for social responsible investing. It all sits in product and geography and businesses that have thresholds to achieve on returns on capital and returns on assets. That caused a lot more creativity too. And that led to us working with others who wanted to participate in risk into these areas that we wouldn't have maybe thought to do before. So we've done work with OPIC. You all maybe know the Overseas Private Investment Corp, the U.S. agency. Organizations like IFC, OPIC, the Dutch, the Germans all have them, KfW, FMO. They all want to have access to financing of organizations, not just in microfinance, but of others, doing supply chain finance. And so around the world, we work with them too, and they risk participate in our facilities. And that's helped us to achieve greater scale even, and better returns on our remaining clean portion of risk. And it was about building it in your business again so that the tools would come out that you wouldn't have used, I think, had it sat at a corporate, goodness box. So we don't have anything that sits up there. It's all, about engaging it and building it in. Finally, some people ask me, so what's next? I'm approached about a whole range of things, and I was thinking there are areas that I think are really interesting, and I mean, certainly affordable housing. I mean, we've got a great history, and many of our peers in this country of banks that have specialized in affordable housing with many tax incentives and other reasons to do it, but and Community Reinvestment Act to compel it in some ways. But huge portfolios and creative work was done in that area that's just completely absent in most of the world. So housing probably has to start first, because so few countries have even housing finance, let alone areas of affordable housing is going to be an area that's very, very significant. I think this interjection between sustainable energy, and I think Peter may talk about that a little bit later on also, and the segments that we're referring to in microfinance of communities is an important one too. And because of cost and health and many others, but the challenge of payback, of investing for something that appears, and it probably has great merit over time, but the sacrifice of finding the money up front to buy it now, and then saying, well, you'll realize the savings over a period of time, or the access to finance to cover it over that period of time is still very, very challenging. And it may be not compelling enough yet for consumers that we're not finding that demand driving it. You find people clearly believe that when they buy a cell phone. They're happy to pay. They pay cash up front, or they get it financed, and it's compelling. And we need to look at the same thing with some of the energy and other areas that we're looking at. It's clearly savings. Savings is the most difficult thing to do. I find credit is, you can be creative, but it's much easier. And you can get it wrong easily too, of course, but it's creating low balance, simple, basic access to savings and payments for people is so fundamental, because before anyone can access credit, really do need savings. You do need some money to buy a house as a deposit. You need some money even if you have a scholarship. You need money to start even a small business of capital. So the ability to save and the culture of savings is much less looked at by most banks. And so that side of the balance sheet, from an advertising, marketing, product development, I think has been much, much less developed. And I'm very keen on savings. I think it's the area we should put a lot of energy in and thought. And then finally, I get a number of groups have asked me about things such as social capital markets. I know in Singapore and a few places, this is very much in discussion. And I just, again, we're always a little cautious on this because I'm not quite sure what qualifies or what you'd put on the market. Many of you know in microfinance Kiva.org, which is a very, very dynamic and quite popular way of people who can go on and decide you want to lend through an organization and whatever. There are some stages in that, but you basically can lend to people whose small businesses are being profiled, and it's very compelling. There's the individual, there's the story. It's online. You can do it for small amounts and be part of the sense of someone's success. And there it was a matching up of interest and need and story. When we came to there's Microplace, another very interesting concept that was set up, and it's now owned by eBay. It was about creating a platform for, again, investing in securities that would be, in that sense, started off as microfinance. The challenge there was it was almost creating the marketplace, the stock exchange, if you will, before you have either the instrument or the demand. And I think, the benefit of eBay was everybody was already buying and selling all this junk from each other, their collectibles, the products, in yard sales and informal networks and everything else. Suddenly you had this place you could find even more people who were collecting whatever, you were looking for, or buying or selling. This great clearinghouse. But it was already there, the buyers and the sellers, the interest, the subject. I'm only concerned that a social, stock exchange or marketplace may predate the actual choice of investable instruments and even the clarity of who's going to buy them and for what purpose. Because when you look at most institutional investors, they have many, many requirements. They're not going to buy it on an exchange, fiduciary ones and restrictions on them. But when we look at that, it is exciting, the idea, but I would always turn around and look very much first, though, what are you going to put on the exchange, and who do you think is really going to buy it that you need an exchange in order to achieve? Usually the exchange comes in after you've had so much vibrancy that you're looking for efficiency and also supervision in some ways and control. And those areas I think will take off. But you know, I'm very excited, and I look forward to seeing some of the other discussions today. I believe at Citi, you know, for us, microfinance was a learning about taking something we had long believed in and worked on philanthropically, and trying to say, how do we also embed that in our business, in a real embedding of the business. And in a lot of the environmental finance, related finance and sustainability we're doing, has a very similar experience. It's difficult because those are larger ticket items and they're lumpier in many ways. You don't have this intermediary group. But it is about betting in the business. And finally, the value of intermediaries and those who can bring you, in whatever your social enterprise is, the connection between the understanding of that client where the demand may lie, and those providers and manufacturers and larger organizations of product or finance, and what they could achieve if they could work together. And for us, that's been about how we've accelerated much, much more so than I believe we could ever have done trying to do this on our own. So thank you very much, and I look forward to spending part of the day with you. Thanks. Okay, I'll talk. There's a microphone there and there. If anyone has any questions, I can't really see. Yeah.
Bill Harrington with Vista Ventures. If microfinance has an Achilles heel, it's probably in the cost charge to the borrowers, what we call the portfolio yield. And yet, in certain countries where there's a lot of competition, the portfolio yield has gone down from 30 or 40% to say 20 or 30%. But in the last few years, with all this money coming into microfinance, it has tended to go to what we sometimes call the top tier of microfinance institutions. Maybe 2% of the institutions that control something like 60% or more of the assets. And that is a trend that concerns me because in my view, what we really want to do is to lower the portfolio yield and therefore put more money in the pockets of the borrowers. And so I was wondering what your view or Citigroup's view is of this increasing scale and perhaps the diminution in competition in certain sectors of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's probably so unusual in most industries that you start to get this concentration issue, which is sometimes unfortunate. But what is clear, one is about the cost of funds to the borrower, the end borrower. The cost of funds for borrowing institutions in microfinance is has always been relatively attractive. I think they've always been able to borrow at very good rates compared to their other, if they look at their other institutions in their country, partly because of access to donor funding as well. Sometimes there are others, as in India, priority sector lending requirements of the Reserve Bank. But the biggest chunk in most of microfinance portfolios of cost is not the cost of funds nor the credit loss, which in much of our businesses would be. It's the operating cost. And where we've seen the cost to the client go down the most has been, as you say, in some markets, I think in Bolivia, for example, and elsewhere, through competition, through really very active competition. Peru, same thing. Also markets where the banks have begun to enter into that space for some of the clients as well. That could be, with the right infrastructure of credit bureaus and things, that also starts to bring down the cost of funds. The transparency of rates. There are many nonprofits that have rates that are very hard to derive too. When you look at fees, sometimes mandatory savings accounts and other things that have a negative carry, you go through it, you really want to know what is the APR or any benchmark that's in common between them. Good work going on in that area in microfinance. Microfinance spent a long time becoming institutionally transparent. You could look at you've got great data if you go to mixedmarket.org and you'll see the financials of all these institutions just as you would most banks, very well presented and current, but not about the client. The transparency at the client level and consistent presentation of cost is much less so. So I think the biggest challenge in most institutions is to bring down their operating cost. Those who are achieving scale are obviously able to do that more. And that's where capital has been attracted to, I think, in terms of lending. And those who invest, that's a different decision when you're an equity investor than which we're not. than a lender, because there isn't that much of a difference between India's largest microfinance institutions' borrowing cost and many of the much smaller ones in the country. But their models of cost are very different. And so it has been a good debate in microfinance to look at the end cost to the client, because one, it wasn't discussed for a long time, and it wasn't all that transparent. I think it was just embedded in straight repayments or declining repayments. I mean, many stories and good reasons for maybe the way the product was designed, but the clarity of what someone actually pays for something and comparing it, and if you're a donor or a funder, you want to know what that is, wasn't the case. And I think what's happening now through competition and through a lot more attention to the sector is it's much more obvious, and there are big projects in India and elsewhere to be able to see all the institutions shown. And as institutions become regulated, as in Mexico, when you become a bank, suddenly all those rates had to be published, and they weren't before. So I think it is one of those areas where, as you reach scale, there's been a healthy debate. Right. Someone heading up to the other one? One more.
Hi. Good morning. My name is Franklin Moore. I work for the Queens Economic Development Corporation. We're a small nonprofit. We get funding through Citi Foundation, and it's been great. It really helps our small entrepreneurs, micro enterprises. I was wondering if there was anything that Citi, Global was doing in order to whatever funds that reach those community development organizations, that there's some type of metric tools in order to better assess the impact from Citi, what Citi is doing, because as you said, many nonprofits or organizations, sometimes don't have that scale or capacity in order to measure those things. So if there's a possibility for big organizations like Citi to have some type of measurement, whether that's social return on investment, in order to possibly increase capital to reach those organizations by partnering maybe with local or government to track that.
Yeah, no, it is a good question, and it's followed very late, all these initiatives, not just Citi. I mean, I'd say generically about measuring impact. In the international side, where public money was going, forget about just foundation money, but large amounts of public money into the sector, there was very little other than the anecdotal stories or self-reported impact that we had, which many institutions were trying to demonstrate impact and assess it, but there was an inconsistency of that, certainly in microfinance globally, and now some donors whose money comes out of a public budget for poverty alleviation, for example, I think I'm on the board of CGAP at the World Bank, which is the group that looks at microfinance, and I can think of the Kingdom of Sweden, shows it comes from their budget of poverty alleviation. But does the funding that they then apply actually achieve anything? Is that what it's achieving, or is it achieving financial inclusion in a way that we may think is also beneficial, but is not what the taxpayer thought there? This measuring of impact against intent, at least, is surprisingly rudimentary, I think. And I think it is in the States, maybe particularly. I think the States, in many ways, is someone who came to looking at it later in their careers, and having been looking at things in markets where there were no incentives, the whole Community Reinvestment Act, compelling in some ways, defining where funding and grant money needed to go, has in some ways distorted a lot of that, because there are concentrations where banks have got to do things in the areas of development, we call it, but whether philanthropically or lending, investing, that are defined geographically in a very narrow sense by the regulation, and it's led to those areas having returns that are not commensurate or even not even measuring impact with the expectations they should have, while only miles away or a state away where there's very little presence of the same kind of organizations, there is a scramble for funding. And so we've tried to look more and more now at, and we are assessing, and certainly I'm on the board of the foundation, how the impact of those institutions we fund, what is that impact? Now they'll vary, of course, like if you're doing small business or financial education, and trying to establish our own matrices in very many ways. But I think there's been more progress that I'm aware of on the international front, where we're looking at social impact analysis and study to get some consistency than I have yet domestically. It was too often, like financial education, how many people went through the course? How many people did you train? But we know it's like training people, talking about nutrition in a country of overweight people. I mean, how many classes did you have on nutrition? But what happened? And so it's really that, it's going, and for us, that's why we go beyond now financial education very much, to one of where you really can assess whether people have then been able to access finance or change behavior. And I think that behavioral analysis study that some of the academics have been leading on also in a number of places is helping us very much. Okay, one last if it's quick. Thanks. I'm looking at our timekeeper.
Okay.
He's very diligent.
Good morning. Thank you for your time. My name is Alana Livo. I was a Fulbright scholar in Bolivia doing microfinance work. So thanks for all the great work by Citi. I was just curious, actually, to follow up to that point. Given that Muhammad Yunus's objective, I understand it from its outset, was not only to provide capital, but also to really raise the standard of living and advance the socioeconomic output. And in my study, I found that looking across the diverse institutions, that the nonprofit groups that did integrate these social types of programs, the trainings, the healthcare, had a greater, longer term impact. Do you think that the private groups, the financial banks, really should be providing those types of trainings alongside, or is their role really to just extend the capital and provide that opportunity for those who don't yet have access to credit?
I think there's a need for a wide range of organizations to provide access to finance. I mean, as most of you have choice when you choose financial services. Be that said, when you look at the most vulnerable communities and the lowest income, and many of the groups we'll talk about, sometimes CGAP, they're called the ultra poor, and Ramin has a program, they do not need to start with a loan. Somebody who has no assets, and this is displaced people or really people who have no financial assets. I don't think that's where we begin with a loan. And that's why I think moving beyond what even Professor Yunus often will call microcredit is so important, because it isn't about credit in that case. It's about asset building and livelihoods development. And that's where groups like Brock and some of the ones you'll talk about are very, very focused for some of their clients. And I think it is the understanding of differentiating individuals and communities and their needs. And that if you're in Bolivia or you're in Bangladesh or India, and the vast majority of the population we would call underserved or even low income or poor, but they're a great strata of that, right? If 80% of the population in Bolivia doesn't have a bank account, the people who are at the bottom 10 and 20 and 30 and 40% have different needs, and they're urban and they're rural, and they're self-employed or they're employed. And we need to be able to see the faces in many ways of the people we serve. So I think there is a range for all these institutions. I think there's a range for postal savings banks and cooperatives. Right? Japan has $3 trillion or something in the postal bank. It may sound boring, but it works for many people. It is a point of contact. And why we work with a range of institutions is, frankly, because they all serve different clients. And I don't know that financial inclusion in its own right is enough of an answer. I think it's a goal, it's an objective goal, but to do it responsibly is another, and that's partly where you're looking for the transparency, and I think for us, the partnering with organizations that in many ways are trying to define those boundaries, if you will,
Thank you.
So I agree with you, thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, Bob, for what is a great start to the conference. I think one great challenge with an area that has seen so much hype as microfinance is to actually say something new and insightful, and we've definitely had both. As someone who's been an outside observer to the field, the immense and complicated set of issues in this area is certainly a little clearer to me now. We have more coffee, I think also more food outside for you before we move to our next sessions at 9:45. Thanks very much.